seriously popular.
Those division bells for a vote. Hear them everywhere you go in this place. I think technically you're supposed to be able to hear them in bars nearby, but I don't know if you can.
Back in September, I gave my producer Bella a tour of the Dáil.
They're the division bells. For a very brief period of Rose Conway Walsh's interview, they're going.
Not bad. We had the same with Desi Ellis, didn't we?
We just finished a big round of interviews and, after several months researching Sinn Féin, Bella wanted to see the place at the heart of the action.
I think this was actually the front of the house. Originally. Here we go over here.
Railway Street.
As we look backwards, we can see Leinster House, the original house, which is there since the early 1700s. It was originally the home of the Duke of Leinster, who was an Anglo-Irish member of the nobility. And since about 1922, this is our national parliament and has been expanded.
The Duke of Leinster was a descendant of Protestant settlers. These settlers, from England and Scotland, were granted land seized from the Irish by a succession of British monarchs.
They designed things so well in the 17th century.
We don't have to walk very far to come across further reminders of Britain and Ireland's shared history.
As we leave Leinster House, we can see a statue of Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's consort, half hidden by bushes on his plinth. We can see him pretty clearly from here. No idea why he's still there.
In the Dáil, these signifiers of Britain's role in Ireland's history sit alongside memorials to another political tradition, one that was constructed in direct opposition to Britain, Irish nationalism.
That's a plinth to our martyrs and heroes of the revolutionary period between 1916 and 1922. From here I can just see Michael Collins is there. That's Arthur Griffith. He was the founder really of Sinn Féin. He was a journalist, and he initially proposed the solution to the Great Irish Problem, as the British Parliament called it.
This revolutionary period culminated in the creation of an independent state, ruled from Dublin, with Leinster House as the seat of a new parliament. It's also the period from which many of the modern political parties in the Republic trace their lineage. And next week, voters will have their say on which of these parties they want to lead the next Irish government. 8 weeks after Bella and I stood in the steps of Leinster House on that quiet late summer afternoon, I was back in altogether different circumstances.
I will now travel to Áras an Uachtaráin to advise President Higgins to dissolve Dáil Éireann to allow a general election to be held on Friday, the 29th of November.
And over the next 3 weeks, I will seek a mandate to continue as your Taoiseach and to deliver for you on the things that matter most to you, your family, your community, and to our country.
Among the obstacles facing Taoiseach Simon Harris's incumbent government as he seeks re-election, one stands out as more unpredictable and elusive than the rest: Sinn Féin. Across this series, I've taken you back through the history of Sinn Féin to ask where the party came from and where it might be going. And now, with Ireland just days away from going to the polls, I'm bringing the story up to date. How likely are the former political wing of the Provisional IRA to lead the next Irish government? And what would that mean for Ireland, Britain and beyond? I'm John Lee, I'm the executive editor of The Mail in Dublin, and this is From Bomb to Ballot, the history of Sinn Féin. Episode 7, Changed Utterly.
The Irish political landscape, dominated by two parties for 100 years, has changed utterly.
When it comes to Irish politics, this is what history looks like.
The nationalists were singing the old rebel songs to celebrate their victories in the counts today. Our day will come has long been their slogan. Well, it just might have.
On February 8, 2020, Sinn Féin achieved an historic election result, winning 24.5% of first preference votes and making it the most popular party in the Republic.
So it was the arrival of Sinn Féin as a large and serious party that really separates it out.
This is Teresa Reedy, a senior lecturer at University College Cork and an expert in Irish voting behaviour.
So this was a really fascinating election because for the first time Sinn Féin entered the fray as a serious, large party competing for government power. And up to 2020, that space had really been occupied only by Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael as the kind of two major large parties vying for government power.
The rise in support was so dramatic that they'd failed to stand enough candidates to benefit fully from their vote share, and they didn't end up in government. But they'd announced their arrival as the Republic's main opposition party, with one hell of a bang. How had they done it?
The great financial crisis, which started in 2008, and the general election in 2011 really kind of disrupted or upended the party system in the Republic, particularly with the implosion of Fianna Fáil.
In the financial crash, Ireland suffered among the highest job losses of any country, and the worst bank crash relative to the size of an economy in history. In the first election afterwards, Sinn Féin won 14 seats.
And it really altered the nature of political party competition at elections. And over that period since 2011, what we have seen is a great deal of volatility in the Irish party system. So the kind of picture as you're heading into 2020 is one of fragmentation, so lots of smaller political parties, but also volatility, a lot of changing from one election to the next election. And 2020, in many ways, it's a kind of a continuation of the upward trajectory of Sinn Féin.
It wasn't just broader political trends that paved the way for the 2020 result. In the decades since the financial crash, change had been afoot in Sinn Féin too.
I will not be standing for the Dáil in the next election, neither will my friend and comrade Martin Ferris. And I want to thank Martin, Marie and our clan for years of service to the Republic.
In 2018, Gerry Adams stood down as President of Sinn Féin, a role he'd held for over 30 years. Alongside him, Martin Ferris, the one-time Gaelic football star, who'd been caught off the coast of Kerry in 1984, with 7 tons of ammunition destined for provisional IRA use. Just 4 years apart in age, their careers, which had seen them transform from militant Republicans, a claim that Adams has always denied, to mainstream politicians, mirrored Sinn Féin's own evolution since the 1980s. Both now in their 70s, the time for a changing of the guard had arrived.
Leadership means knowing when it's time for change. And that time is now. I have complete confidence in the next generation of leaders.
And Adams' replacement? A privately educated middle-class Dubliner, armed with a degree in English literature, a defunct membership of the Republic's centre-right party Fianna Fáil, and no personal connection to the Troubles.
So, please welcome the President-elect of our party, Mary Lou McDonald.
I humbly accept and receive the democratic nomination for the leadership of Ireland's oldest and greatest political party, Sinn Féin. My political mentor, an inspirational leader, a great friend. Gerry Adams, more than anybody, built Sinn Féin, and his leadership has guided our party to its strongest position since partition.
And I think it also has to be said that in 2020, Sinn Féin had a very good team, and they had a popular female leader who was really important in kind of marking a break with the party's past.
Teresa Reedy again.
This was Mary Lou McDonald, particularly good communicator, and she was kind of projecting a new, more modern Sinn Féin, a Sinn Féin that couldn't be connected directly to the kind of ethnic conflict in Northern Ireland and the terrorist campaigns.
Gerry Adams, along with prominent former IRA prisoners like Martin Ferris, had been instrumental in bringing the majority of the provisional IRA along with the peace process. But in the Republic, they continued to be hampered at the polls by their association with violence.
I think it's important to remember that in the Republic, Section 31, the law meant that we couldn't hear representatives of Sinn Féin. So I was an adult before I ever heard Gerry Adams speak. So the context is quite important in terms of the party wasn't just marginalised. I mean, it really... It wasn't banned, but it was close to that situation, you know, so it faced a very kind of challenging context.
Mary Lou McDonald was one of a new generation of Sinn Féin politicians who had no direct involvement in the IRA's militant campaign. She joined Sinn Féin in 2001 and had been mentored by her political hero, Gerry Adams, who subsequently handpicked her to be the next leader. Her election was a conscious attempt to broaden Sinn Féin's electoral appeal in the Republic to those who would never have considered voting for her predecessors, and thus guide the party into the mainstream.
The truth is, my friends, I won't fill Gerry's shoes. But the news is that I brought my own. So I will fill my shoes.
And that had policy implications too. Reuniting Ireland was still to be Sinn Féin's raison d'etre.
And we together, over the coming years, will walk a journey that is full of opportunities, full of challenges, but I believe which marks a defining epoch, a defining chapter in our achievement of a united Ireland and the ending of partition.
But the party's focus had increasingly expanded beyond this single issue. And in 2020, many of their leftist socially liberal policies did seem to chime with the voters. With Ireland in the midst of a chronic housing crisis, it was one of the defining issues of the election campaign, and Sinn Féin's promises struck a chord.
I mean, I think the first thing that Sinn Féin did was recognise that there was an acute housing shortage and that it affected actually quite a large group in society. Then in terms of the kind of solutions that they were pitching, something of a difference kind of became evident as well, and that is that Sinn Féin really was advocating for much more public intervention in the housing market and the use of government to provide more homes and to provide more public homes, more council housing and more social and affordable housing. So it benefited from having an exceptional spokesperson on housing, Eoin O'Brien. It had some kind of well-crafted policies.
Eoin O'Brien, the former bass guitar player turned ardent Republican, who we last met as a young Sinn Féin activist on the streets of Belfast in the late 90s, had steadily made his way through various local and European government positions in the intervening 2 decades. After 2 failed attempts, he'd finally been elected to the Dáil in 2016. O'Brien typified a new generation of younger Sinn Féin voters who were attracted to the party as much by their social conscience as their nationalist credentials. I asked O'Brien whether he considered himself to be more left-wing than his colleagues.
I don't think so. I might articulate it in a more kind of conscious way, which is as much a part of my background and my education. But no, in the sense that, like, if you look at the big kind of policy propositions around the party, they're either about substantially increased investment in public services and universal public services or services for people on middle and lower incomes. If you look at where we stand on taxation, again, it's all about recalibrating the taxation system to make it much more fair and much more equitable, particularly for average and below average income workers. If you look at our positions in international relations and politics, they're all classically left of centre.
Eoin O'Brien, whose constituency is Dublin Midwest, typifies the urban liberal vote that Sinn Féin successfully harnessed in 2020. But they also did well in rural communities, where voting patterns had been historically entrenched. In 1922, Ireland's first nationalist movement split. The result was a bloody civil war and the eventual emergence of 2 new political parties, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. Historically, it was this nationalist movement, not its later incarnation in Northern Ireland, from which the Provisional IRA and modern Sinn Féin emerged, that determined politics in the Republic, where families are still likely to vote depending on which side their family took in the Civil War. In 2020, that changed.
Mayo was a very conservative county, and there would have been no Sinn Féin representation for 100 years there.
Rose Conway Walsh was elected to the Dáil in 2020. She's now the TD for Mayo, a vast rural county on Ireland's west coast. In Mayo, she'd had a long walk to power, built on growing grassroots support.
I ran first for election to Mayo County Council in 2004. And so at 2020, I would say in relation to Mayo that I had built up incrementally.
Rose, like her new boss Mary Lou McDonald, represented Sinn Féin's new brand of mainstream respectability. Her CV included a decade-long stint living in London, a successful career in marketing, and a side hustle at the House of Lords Bar. She believes that her win in Mayo was down to the electorate casting aside historic allegiances.
I think we had decades of people being led by what side their families were on in the Civil War. And then they followed that pathway. Now, I think that was very detrimental. Particularly, you had such successive governments over the years had such an ability to predict whether a parish or a county or whatever, how they would vote. So they never needed to invest in the rural areas in particular in the way that they might have needed to do were they unsure of how people might vote. Now I find what's happened over the years, and what particularly happened in 2020 is people were no longer afraid and people were confident to make choices that would be the better choices for them economically and socially.
Rose argues that the 2020 result showed that voters now saw Sinn Féin as the vehicle for an attractive set of policy propositions, not some ex-militant interloper from across the border.
And this is how it connects to the North in the sense that this is why peace and the reconciliation is so, so very important. That people don't just vote based on history, but they vote for the government and for the representatives that they are going to be economically and socially better off with.
That was a view echoed by Theresa Reedy.
I think that is actually one of the crucial differences, is that Sinn Féin now exists as an entity with an important voice and things to say on politics in the Republic, where, you know, the nationalist schism is a historic schism. It's a discussion related to the Civil War from 100 years ago. It's not the lived reality of everyday life in the Republic, as it still remains to be the case in Northern Ireland.
Unlike the North, the Republic of Ireland had not, in living memory, been the site of a widespread conflict related to the ending of partition on the island.
So, you know, in terms of thinking about it in that way, that is the interesting thing that's happened, is that Sinn Féin has become a party of the Republic as much as it is of Northern Ireland, with important things to say about politics, day-to-day politics, and not just having an identity that is connected really to the conflict in Northern Ireland.
When Rose, Owen and their 35 other Sinn Féin colleagues arrived at the Dáil in 2020, they did so on the back of a coalition that stretched across the island of Ireland. Their support of the Republic was no longer contingent on, or hampered by, depending on which way you look at it, their nationalist ambitions and militant past. Mary Lou McDonald was widely considered Taoiseach in waiting. The weight of history had been shed, job done, or so they thought. 4 years is a long time in politics.
This is a tense time for the city, which has just experienced its worst violence in decades.
Well, I think you kind of have to understand that, we all do, that the politics is dynamic and people change their mind.
Theresa Reedy again.
And then I think the kind of serious issue for them came in the form of the politicisation of immigration.
On November the 23rd, 2023, Dublin was flooded with far-right rioters, nearly 500 of them. Sparked by the stabbing of 3 school children and a teacher by an Algerian-born naturalised citizen, the riots quickly escalated in response to growing anti-immigrant sentiment in Ireland.
There's disgraceful scenes, and we have a complete lunatic hooligan faction driven by far-right ideology, and also then this disruptive tendency here, and engaged then in serious violence.
Sinn Féin, despite their new, younger, more liberal leadership and support base, still attracted anti-establishment nationalist voters. It was an uneasy and unusual coalition, and immigration proved to be the wedge that drove it apart. Initially, Sinn Féin condemned the riots.
Sinn Féin are a nationalist party first and foremost, but I think over time they've moved away from a kind of a narrow vision of ethno-nationalism, a very narrow kind of ethno-nationalist kind of view of the world, particularly in the Republic, to a kind of more cosmopolitan nationalism. And I think in 2023, the people who were on the picket lines that had kind of sympathised with and voted for Sinn Féin for a long time kind of realised that, you know, Sinn Féin was not with them on this issue. It was their kind of shared anti-establishment sentiment perhaps that had brought them to Sinn Féin. But when something like migration started to be a more serious issue for those voters, they found themselves leaning more towards kind of the far right.
Mary Lou McDonald called for calm.
When small children lay in hospital being treated for horrific injuries, a mob, fuelled by hate, who believe that they are beyond the law, wreaked havoc on Dublin city. Their actions were disgraceful and criminal. Everyone who participated should hang their head in shame for the disgrace that they have brought upon this city and our people. They should face the full rigours of the law.
But she had little positive effect. The party then tabled a motion of no confidence in the Minister for Justice. It was a mistake. It created the perception that they were siding with disorder. Sinn Féin support in the polls plummeted. By the local elections last June, they'd sunk to 12% in the polls. In truth, they'd lost support on all sides. By criticising the rioters and then tabling their motion, they'd failed to articulate a coherent position on the issue.
So at times it kind of spoke a tougher line on migration, but it was never seriously moving in the direction of becoming an anti-immigrant party, because it hasn't done that before. And in fact, it's a party that has kind of courted the youth vote. It's been progressive on LGBT issues. I think there is a schism there, a break, if you want. And I think quite a few of those voters are lost to Sinn Féin. In many ways, Sinn Féin was probably a temporary home for them.
There are clear political reasons for Sinn Féin's meteoric rise and the recent slump in the polls. Like many voters, I hail from a geography and generation where Sinn Féin and violence are still inextricably linked. As a journalist, it's my job to put that aside. But there are things that I can't get away from. Sinn Féin, in my view, and it's a view that's echoed across the island of Ireland, is still not a normal democratic party. It was apparent a few days after the 2020 election, at a Sinn Féin press conference, when I tried to put my questions to the would-be Taoiseach.
Free press are here. Why would you bring us all here and not answer questions?
And who should be watching on from the audience but...
The man from the Daily Mail.
Why did you bring the media here and not answer any questions?
I know I sound a little frustrated there, and that's because I was, extremely so. And not just because Gerry Adams had quoted a Republican song at me. Sinn Féin have a historically fraught relationship with the media. It's an overhang from the days of the Provisional IRA's broadcast bans. Their opaque approach makes it harder for me to do my job. That's fine. But it also adds to my sense of their unfitness for office. And despite new leadership and a young, left-wing voter base, it's hard to get away from the feeling that Sinn Féin hasn't totally shed its murky past.
I was 11 effectively when the bombing stopped in our country.
Simon Harris is Taoiseach, our Prime Minister of Ireland. He's also the leader of Fine Gael, one of Ireland's biggest political parties.
And yeah, I have childhood memories of the radio being on in the house. I have childhood memories of hearing about ceasefires and the likes. I remember the campaign for the Good Friday Agreement. I remember the historic scenes on the news, and I remember characters like Mo Mowlam appearing on the Late Late Show, and I remember hearing at the time of Bertie Ahern going back up to the north after his mother's funeral to try and get the peace talks done. So I have vivid memories of that.
Born in 1986, Harris is a child of the peace process.
We're on an island that is so much more peaceful now than it ever has been. My children grow up in a much safer, brighter, more peaceful Ireland than certainly my parents and grandparents did, and isn't that a great thing to have? And we can't allow kind of history be rewritten in terms of the level of violence, the level of brutality, the level of killing that went on during that period, during what is known in Ireland as the Troubles.
Columba disappeared 47 years, 7 months and 20 days ago, and I still have hope. It's hope that's given me the confidence to speak his name. We hope that the nightmare will cease. Hope for tomorrow will be a better day than today.
Columba McVeigh was a teenager when he was abducted from Donaghmore in County Tyrone by the IRA in 1975.
When I was Justice Minister, I would have met, for example, with the family of Columba McVeigh.
Simon Harris again.
I went up to a bog in Monaghan where they were carrying out the latest search.
The Independent Commission for the Location of Victims' Remains was established by the British and Irish governments in 1999 to locate the disappeared. Columba McVeigh, along with 3 others, including Robert Nairac, has never been found. In October 2022, the Commission had begun a new search, their 6th, for Columba's body in the vast Bragan Bog, which straddles the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic.
And just to meet Columba's brother and sister and hug them and get that sense of great hope. Will today be the day we finally find Columba? Will today be the day we can finally give him a Christian burial?
On the first day of the search, Columba's brother spoke to journalists.
It's a bit of deja vu. We've been here before, but hopefully this time maybe we'll find him and have a happy, when I say a happy ending, I mean an ending that we want. And it's important to tell, the Sinn Féin people and the IRA people and whoever and the Republican movement, we want to find his body. We're not going away. We want answers. We want people to come tell us where he is. We just want the result that is going to lead to burying him in Donegal.
Investigators searched 26 acres of the bog for over a year.
And I remember sitting in a room in Leinster House in our Parliament, and I remember one of the families saying to me, I never thought I'd look forward to a funeral so much. They've never been given the right to just have their body back, just to have a Christian burial, just to bury their loved one. And to no avail, they still haven't found him at the time we're talking.
In November 2023, the search ended without success. All they'd found was an historical mortar bomb.
And what happened to the disappeared was just the most disgusting, despicable behaviour you can imagine. Not only was your loved one killed, they were disappeared. And I have no doubt today, absolutely no doubt, that there's people alive today who could help those families, who could help bring the closure. Whilst absolutely recognising the progress that this island has made in terms of peace and not in any way jumping over that fact, we shouldn't fool ourselves in terms of thinking that reconciliation is there.
Of course, it's Simon Harris's job to be critical of Sinn Féin. But it's not just their connection to decades-old violence that Sinn Féin's opponents continue to level at them. There's no getting away from the connections to a more modern type of criminality.
There are smiling photographs of Mary Lou McDonald and Jonathan Dowdall before he became an elected councillor. There's footage of him, I think, where she had been doorstepped by journalists in Dublin City, and he's very much in the background there.
Debbie McCann is an award-winning crime correspondent.
They were very much connected and obviously working in the same constituency and all of that, were very well known to each other. Now, she says that she had no inkling that he had any criminal connections.
In October 2022, as investigators were beginning their search in Bragan Bog for Columba McVeigh, his family watching on with renewed hope of finding him, former Sinn Féin councillor named Jonathan Dowdall was in court, where he admitted the charge of facilitating murder. In 2016, a boxing competition at the Regency Hotel in Dublin descended into gang violence. One man was fatally shot. The shootout was part of a long-running feud between the Dublin-based criminal Gerry Hutch, known as the Monk, and Daniel Kinahan, head of one of the world's biggest organised crime gangs.
Yeah, it was essentially a revenge attack that Gerry Hutch's gang took on the Kinahan gang. They dressed as armed Gardaí, went in with AK-47s, and they shot dead a guy called Liam Byrne, who would have been an associate of Daniel Kinahan. In the course of that attack, that obviously made international headlines because there happened to be a Sunday newspaper parked outside and that got photographs of these guys dressed as Gardaí going in with their AK-47s. There was also photographs of one of the guys involved, an IRA man called Flat Cap Murray, emerging from the hotel with a handgun.
Jonathan Dowdall was a family friend of Gerry Hutch, and he'd booked a room at the Regency Hotel that was used by Flat Cap Murray the night before the attack. Then, a month later, Dowdall drove his friend across the border to Northern Ireland.
The Gardaí knew that this was happening. They bugged the car. Gerry Hutch and Jonathan Dowdall were talking like pals. There was mention of guns used in the Regency attack.
Not only did their conversation link Jonathan Dowdall to the Regency Hotel shooting, it also made it clear that he had connections to the IRA.
It was accepted by the Special Criminal Court that he was a member of the IRA, and he was driving Gerry Hutch up north. Basically, Gerry Hutch was looking for a mediator between the two sides, between the Hutch gang and the Kinahan gang, to see if the feud could go in a different direction. Now, Dowdall obviously had the connections to make that meeting happen.
As a journalist, I'd be the first to observe that all political parties have had their bad apples. But the direct link between this extreme criminality and the Sinn Féin leadership is hard to ignore. Dowdall had not only been photographed with Mary Lou McDonald, he previously made a donation to her directly and was widely believed to be her protégé. Mary Lou McDonald has said that if she knew about Dowdall's involvement in organised crime, she wouldn't have let him anywhere near the party. Of course, Sinn Féin's opponents are quick to capitalise on their difficulties.
And then look, even right up to the contemporary time, how Sinn Féin deals with issues when they have somebody who was on their staff who's now convicted of child abuse and providing employer references and the likes.
Earlier this year, it was revealed that 2 Sinn Féin press officers provided letters of reference to a departing colleague after he'd been arrested for child sexual offences and suspended from the party.
That person went on to work for the British Heart Foundation. British Heart Foundation did nothing wrong at all, but the British Heart Foundation received employer references from Sinn Féin. Now, you can only give references if they're positive. So not only did they not highlight a safeguarding issue, didn't report it, and then not only, as I say, did they not do those things, they provided employer references. You ended up with a man who is now convicted of sex crimes against a child going on to work for a charity that has contact with children. And then you have the usual ducking and diving, nowhere to be found when there's an answer, when questions to be asked.
Sinn Féin say that the references were provided without clearance from the party and describe their actions as wrong and unacceptable.
So that's Simon Harris's view. But do these scandals cut through to the electorate? And will they impact on Sinn Féin's chances at the ballot box?
You know, particularly that they've kind of added evidence to the suspicions that Sinn Féin isn't a normal democratic political party.
Theresa Reedy again.
And, you know, without going into the individual scandals, I think, you know, collectively these have contributed to some of the kind of malaise within the party. Have they kind of eroded party support? Probably not a huge amount, but have they been a barrier to Sinn Féin kind of reconnecting with voters? Almost certainly. Because they've taken up a huge amount of time from the party leadership. Every time they appear in public and they want to talk about, you know, a policy issue, they get asked for about a month and a half. They got asked about some one or the other of the scandals. And I think, you know, the party is not always very nimble in how it manages these scandals when it comes up. And some of that has to do with its structures and its historical origins. And all of these things are difficult if you want to position yourself as an alternative pole of political power in the country. If you want to talk about policies and your team and you're kind of constantly being pulled back into these issues.
Constantly being pulled back. That could have been the title of this series. Scandals will matter more or less depending on the voter. Many will still be drawn to Sinn Féin's specific brand of left-wing populism. Some still won't feel able to vote for them due to their association with violence. Others may do so through gritted teeth. And that's before we even get to the contradiction at the heart of Sinn Féin's policy, Irish unification. Still their raison d'etre, their historic MO, but which is not a priority for many voters in the Republic. More so than any political party in modern times, Sinn Féin are still caught between the past and the present. And that has led to a support base who, as their incoherent response to the Dublin riots makes clear, they still don't fully understand. I leave the last word to Dessie Ellis, whose life story echoes so much of Sinn Féin's story. He joined the IRA as a teenager and Sinn Féin in his late 30s, after a decade-long stint in prison. He was first elected to Dublin City Council the year after the Good Friday Agreement and has been a TD for Dublin North West since 2011. Irish republicanism has changed beyond recognition in his lifetime. At the end of our interview, I asked him what he made of Sinn Féin's chances in this election.
I think it's always difficult to judge. One thing I've learned in politics is that you can break your neck and you can do everything possible. And if there is a swing or if there is a momentum, it's there, you cannot stop it. So if the momentum begins and we're riding high in that momentum, it's unstoppable. That's the way it is. It spreads into communities. It's like once that momentum starts, it's very difficult to stop it, no matter what you've done, you know.
That might be wishful thinking, but Sinn Féin has proved itself time and time again to be capable of miraculous change. It's a party that still has former IRA prisoners in its ranks, but it's also the party of figures like Owen O'Brien and Rose Conway Walsh, untouched by the past. Changed utterly? I'm not so sure, but Sinn Féin is on the march, one way or another. From Bomb to Ballot is presented by me, John Lee. It is produced by Artemis, Irvine and Bella Soames. The assistant producer is Sally McLennan. Sound design is by John Scott. Podcast artwork is by Lindsay Fagan. The script consultant is Liam Thompson.